The presentation is booked on the material, comes from the material in this book. John Dickenberg has an outstanding Navy career, both in ships and submarines. He captained two of the Oberon submarines, one of which is at the museum. And he's written this book about crisis and leadership at sea. 100 years from the Titanic to the Costa Concordia is when things really went bad. How did people, the captains, it's more as much about the captains as the ship. How did their upbringing come into play? How did their personality come into play? And what did they do here in a crisis situation? The photo, that's the cover of the book. It's got the Titanic and Captain John Smith. That's not Captain Dickenberg's photo. So it's based on that. And if any of you want a great read about the maritime disasters and how captains handle it, there's 14 in this book. Great reading. All right, we'll have a quick commercial break. Hope you've all been to the Maritime Museum in Darling Harbour. It's #2 in the world, independently assessed. Greenwich is #1. A lot of the assessment is based on the historical content. And of course, Greenwich has got a lot more than we have. You can see a destroyer, a submarine, patrol boat, the Endeavour, of course, the James Craig, the Crite, which has just had $1 million plus spent on it. So it will last hopefully forever. Magnificent steam yacht Dina. And now the dive has come across from Western Australia, first European ship to visit Australia in 1606. Really interesting ship to have a look at. But we're here to hear the story of Captain Francesco Schettino as much as the ship. So what we're going to have a look at is the ship itself, the captain, the shipping industry at this point in time. It's 2012. The timeline of how things happened, what happened on the bridge, the rescue to get 4,000 people off, the chain of events. There's normally not one single thing. If you've watched aircraft investigation or anything like that, it's always a series of things that causes a disaster. The changes as a result of this, an inquiry, of course, and their recommendations. Then the really interesting part is the salvage of this huge ship. How do you get rid of a ship? It's in a pristine marine area. The economy of the island depends on tourists coming here, and then the scrapping. And of course, just as we find out today now with COVID, there's a lot of people that don't always agree with the findings or anything, and just are disagreeable. So what's the company safety record? Qantas wouldn't be proud of this, by the way. 2005, fire on one of these ships. Gangway collapse, collision with a ship, crash into a dock, fire, crash into a pier, another crash into a pier, collision with the ship, then on fire twice, and then in 2012, Costa Concordia accident, which is what we're going to have a look at. Now let's have a look at the ship itself. Carnival owns over half of the cruise ships in the world. This is just one of their lines. It cost, now remember a couple of these numbers, cost $900 million to build. It came into service in 2006. Remember a couple of numbers here. 100,000 tons, 3,000 passengers, the length of 3 football fields. The length of 3 football fields and 100,000 tons give you some idea that this in its day was one of the largest ones. It is huge. And it's not large by comparison to the latest cruise ships. To get the cost per passenger down, they've just got bigger and bigger. We're now up to over 2,000 tons and over 6,000 passengers. But in its day, it was one of the largest cruise ships. Here it is alongside a wharf, beautiful looking ship. If you're wondering what does 100,000 tons look in Navy terms, the US nuclear aircraft carriers are 100,000 tons. The cost is slightly different, like billions of dollars, not millions of dollars, but put it in perspective. Here it is out at sea, and this was a 7-day cruise they were going to get on. The red star here is as far as they got, 3 hours into a 7-day voyage. Now, if I say to you, well, what ships, what are the famous ships you can immediately remember? You'll go, oh yeah, the Titanic. Here's a model of the Titanic against the Costa Concordia. You can see it's much larger than the Titanic. Now, what other ship is right at the front of your mind that you can remember? Well, you should remember this one. It's called the Ruby Princess. So why is it called Concordia? It's all about the unity and peace between the European nations. So it was completed in 2005. Now, this industry is expanding so quickly, the standards and that just can't keep up. By the time everyone agrees to a standard, it's obsolete. So it's been built to quite old standards. It's quite fast, 20 knots. Like a lot of liners, it's diesel engines, driving electric motors to the propellers. 3,000 passengers, as I mentioned, but all up, you're talking 4,000 people on board, and there's 13 public decks. And it all happened on the 13th of January, 2012. Now, here's a quick lesson in Italian. It's an Italian ship, so of course the decks are named in Italian. Grecia, Greece. The one I like is, as we get towards the end, the one I can always remember. I don't know much Italian, but I can remember Austria, which is quite easy to remember because it's the same in Italian as it is in English. So below those 13 decks is a bulkhead deck to separate the passenger area from all the machinery. And there's 3 decks below, which house all of the engines and all of the equipment. And there's 16 watertight compartments. Coincidentally, that just happens to be the same number of compartments as the Titanic. There's 2 house the engines, one houses the electric motors to drive the propellers, all of the switchboards down there. And if you just stop for a minute to think about the electrical circuits on a huge cruise ship like this into all of the cabins, this is an absolute maze of wires and switches, and it's all down there. And should we get a bit of a leak or whatever, the pumps that are going to pump water out are also down there to control any damage. And like the Titanic, it's all okay with a number of compartments flooded, in this case 2. The ship will remain afloat. Any more than that, and it's going to sink. So he's 52 years old. Now, is this a good way to get a job or not, to have your mother the ship owner's daughter? He sailed with tankers and large ferries, but no experience with liners. Takes over on 2006. He's married with a family. And when interviewed for the job by the Costa president, amongst other notes from the interview, is 2 words which have never been explained: character issues. What did the president see that caused him to write down those 2 words? When the inquiry was held and the officers were interviewed, they just described him as arrogant, show-off, braggart, and a really old-fashioned captain. Does not listen. I just do what I say. I'm in charge here. Don't bother to answer back. Don't offer advice. Just do what I say. So not a great team player. So here's the timeline for Captain SCHETTINO. The rock strike on the day. The next day he's detained, and we'll see during the story why that. Very quickly, they offer the passengers compensation for the loss of the voyage and their personal belongings. However, this is a pristine marine environment, and they're fined $1 million for the damage they do there. A year later, they're all on trial. Then finally, 3 years later, after a lot of toing and froing, SCHETTINO is found guilty and sentenced to 16 years in prison. Here he is here. And what's happening in the shipping industry at this point in time? There's rapid technological development. A lot of the liners have azipods. They don't have the traditional shaft and propellers. There's all sorts of technological development. And where do you get people to skipper these, to captain them? They're just not people available with the experience. So they're taking charge of these ships. And well, if I don't have the experience, I've got all this technology, what could possibly go wrong? They don't have the experience to question. I have a part share in a cruiser with a chart plotter and everything on board. And there are times where you go, oh, I don't believe what you're telling me here. So you, with some experience, you can look at the technology and say, I don't think it's working quite right at the moment. And then, of course, with all of the technology, what could possibly go wrong to bring it into a wharf, etc. The regulations to control all of this just don't catch up. And by the way, you can leave a port at this time, and you wouldn't want to inconvenience the passengers by telling them to go to muster stations and explaining lifeboat drills or anything like that. That'd spoil their first day at sea. So you can go to sea for the first day. People don't know where their muster station or anything about lifeboats, anything like that. And as we found out in the Ruby Princess, the crew typically from third world nations here, not well paid. And on this particular cruise, there are people from 40 nationalities here. So communicating with them in a crisis is not going to be easy. So at 7 o'clock, it leaves Rome. 3 hours later, it hits the rock. Then it continues under its own momentum. The breeze and tide turn it around, and it comes back and grounds on rocks that we saw at around about 11. And it's midnight. The rock strike happened at 10. It's midnight before the abandoned ship is given, which is go to the lifeboats and lower them. And it then takes a further 2 hours to get everyone off. There's 32 passengers unaccounted for, and over the following weeks, only 30 bodies are found. They do eventually find the other 2 bodies during the salvage and scrapping. All right, let's have a look on the bridge. Here's an old-fashioned ship. Notice not a lot of computer screens, but both people are looking out, one with binoculars. Here's what a cruise liner bridge looks like. And here's a pilot bringing a very large ship into a harbour. Just have a look and count the number of computer screens that he's got. But what's he doing? He's got a pair of binoculars. The computers here are an aid to navigation, not how you navigate. All right, what's up on the bridge? Of course, the steering, the engine controls. I know I'm talking to sailors, so you know all about this. Thrusters, compasses and charts, chart plotter, radar, bathymeter tells you how much water you've got under it, and the AIS system, which tells you what ships are around you, the course and speed, and the type of ship they are. So you've got an enormous amount of information available to you. So this is what happens on the night. SCHETTINO calls the navigator over and says, look, we're doing a course deviation tonight. We're going to do some touristic navigation, which is take the ship in close to an island and show it off to the people on the island. Nobody else, the engineers, all of the people in the engine room, etc., they all think they're at sea, safely out at sea, and the other officers on the bridge have no idea what's going on. That's not true, the touristic navigation. What he's going to do is do a salute to one of the previous captains who was his mentor and friend, and he's retired on the island. So he's going to bring the ship close into the island, call him on the mobile phone and blow the horn, etc., and give him a salute. The navigator, unfortunately, uses a small scale chart to plot all this, enters it into the system. No one else knows about it, and Francesco goes to dinner. Then he comes back on the bridge as they get close to the island. He's got the maitre d' who previously lived on the island and a lady with him. And now the procedure starts, the salute starts, calls the mentor ashore, and now takes control of the ship. So here's what happens. Up here you can see, or you could see, it's a major deviation. Oops, sorry. It's a major deviation from what was a running between 2 pieces of land. It's a major deviation to come out here alongside the island. This is what it happens. We'll talk about this a little bit more detail later. As it approaches the rock here, there's a call, hard to starboard. The ship comes to starboard, then loses power, and under its own momentum travels up here. The breeze and the current turn it round, and it drifts back until it grounds on rocks here. So that's what happens on the night. Here's the lady that came up on the bridge. She's her name is Dominika Sematorium. She's a dancer. She's previously been part of the entertainment on the ship. And during the inquiry, she had questions like, where were you planning to sleep tonight? You haven't been allocated a cabin and you're not on the passenger list. When she's threatened with jail, she finally admits I'm Schettino's lover. So not only would have his career flashed before his eyes on this night, probably his marriage as well. So now he takes control and he says, oh, I'd like to go in a bit closer. So let's halve the distance. All the other officers are just standing there. He's showing off to his lady. They're just chatting to each other. Nobody's looking at any of the instruments or anything. And he then takes the helm to manual control. He's not actually steering the ship. There's an Indonesian sailor steering the ship under instructions from Schettino. And well, to give a good show, let's put up a bow wave and get up to 16 knots to make it look good. And then just off the port bow, he sights some broken water. Now I'm talking to sailors, I race a yacht. So just think you're approaching a mark which you need to pass on the port side. The breeze will not let you do this. You're aiming straight at the mark and you've got to decide what to do. Fortunately, you don't have too many boats around you. You decide to shoot the mark. Shooting the mark is go hard to starboard, bring the bow away from the mark. As the mark comes down along the side of the boat about midway, you go hard to port, and with a bit of, if you've got enough speed, you'll get around. So he screams at the Indonesian helmsman, hard turn to starboard. Then he screams, hard turn to port. The Indonesian helmsman has no idea what's going on. He turns, looks at Schettino with a look on his face, make up your bloody mind. And in those seconds where all of this, nothing happens, it hits the rock. Nobody knows whether it would have got past if the helmsman would have put it over. So now they know they're in trouble. Immediately they close the watertight doors, but the 3 key compartments start to flood. The engineering crew, who have been absolutely caught by surprise here, are trying to do what they can, but they just can't do it. The lights go out. Salt water and electricity are never a good combination. The emergency power system is down there as well. It gets flooded, so it only runs for a short time. Now they've lost a lot of communication ability and they're now on emergency battery power. The ship starts to list to port. The rock has caused a huge gash in the port side and Schettino goes into absolute deep shock. And one of the things you do when you go into deep shock is absolute denial. Just, it didn't happen. Nothing's changed here. We're all okay. And then starts lying about the situation, withholding information. 10 minutes later, 3 compartments are flooded and 2 more compartments are flooding. You now know the ship is going to sink. The correct procedure here would have been to call a mayday. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Costa Concordia, Costa Concordia, Costa Concordia. I was in Marine Rescue, so I'm familiar with this. And you're on an emergency channel, somebody's going to reply. Then very quickly you give, we are hull, we're sinking, 4,000 people on board and your location. One of the things that the museum has is the call, the mayday call from Winston Churchill in the 98 Sydney Hobart. It just makes your hair stand up when you hear the tone of the voice, knowing that people are going to die, they expect to die, and they did die as a result of that mayday call. The ship's going to sink. The passengers are told, look, we've got an electrical problem here. In a short time, we'll sort it all out and you're okay. And by the way, go back to your cabin and relax. The officers, believe it or not, choose not to intervene. Schettino is in absolute shock, incapable of doing anything, and they choose not to. Well, he's a captain. While he's on the bridge, he's in charge. We just do what he says. And the passengers decide we don't like it. They start to put on life jackets. There is a crisis centre. Most of these places, like aeroplanes, have places that you can call to talk to people. The person they're talking to there is not really good. SCHETTINO says we hit something. That's an understatement. And then it's just the conversation is very vague. And unfortunately, the Crisis Centre director doesn't ask to talk to somebody else, doesn't really do a good job, and then finally says, look, drop your anchors and have a look. So now Marine Rescue gets involved. The passengers are actually calling and making people known that we're in trouble. Life jackets are now issued. Water starts coming into the passenger spaces, so they know they're in trouble, just like the Titanic, and it turns around and comes back. So the ship is now listing to starboard. It has some cross-flooding capability. Once the water comes in and fills the compartments on port, that'll flood across. The breeze, you can imagine the windage, 13 decks and all of the hull above here in a good breeze. So it's listing to starboard under the breeze at the moment. They request a tug, but none available. And then finally, a distress message goes out. Then a general alarm. A general alarm is go to your muster stations. Don't lower the lifeboats, just get ready. But passengers have no idea where to go. They haven't had any safety briefing or any practice here. So it's a case of just like the Titanic, jump in the nearest lifeboat. So it's absolute chaos. They drop the anchors, they don't hold. Now, about midnight, the order is given to abandon ship. The ship grounds. Now, most of these ships are very top heavy. Once they start to list, that list is going to increase unless something stops it. When it grounds, it's got a pivot point now. And of course, with the high center of gravity, as soon as it grounds with a pivot point, it's going to capsize. There's nothing can stop it. And it goes over 60, 70 degrees. And SCHETTINO slips down the deck, according to him, and falls into a lifeboat, which is going to take him to safety. There are still hundreds of passengers on board the ship. Now the passengers just have to fend for themselves, putting the lifeboats, it's listing to starboard. The lifeboats swing way out from the ship, very difficult to load. And then on the port side, they're stuck. They swing onto the ship and they're stuck to the ship. So getting the lifeboats down is a real challenge for people that have had no training, and the crew don't know really how to do it either. So to go from one side of the ship to try a lifeboat the other side is very awkward. And now water starts to come right into the passenger spaces. Now the Coast Guard gets involved and now things start to happen. Rescue boats are diverted. Once you've got a mayday or something like this, the first marine law, as you probably all know, is to help people in trouble, etc. Helicopters come into it, and some attempt to swim to the shore. The water's cold and they dive from quite a height and become injured. And a lifeboat arrives at the port of Giglio, and guess who's in it? SCHETTINO. You probably remember this. It was replayed several times. The Coast Guard commander is ordering him back to the ship. You don't have to go down with this ship, but you are legally required to stay on the ship till everyone on board is rescued or whatever can be done. You are expected to be the last person to leave. You don't have to go down with it. And he just calmly goes to a hotel. There are still hundreds of people on board without anyone in charge of the rescue. Here's what the ship looks like. That's a 70-ton rock. You can see the huge tear here. This rope ladder is very interesting. You probably know what a rope ladder like that is used for. It's used for a pilot to board and leave the ship once it's before it comes in or goes out of port. Another shot, just to give you some idea, if you look at the stabilizer here, it's about the same depth as the rock. It looks as though the stabilizer is not damaged. It looks as though the turn to starboard was successful and the stabilizer cleared the rock. And obviously the turn to port, the stern didn't. It's back here again. You can see the port of Giglio, lifeboats. Now, here's when the ship comes up to give you some idea it has to be scrapped. Just look at the amount of damage here. There's another shot here. It's resting on two rock outcrops, one here and one here. The divers go down and quickly assess it. This is a write-off. This is going to have to be scrapped. There's no repair possible. So close up of the rock, and here's what that rope ladder is used for. You can see here the people. Now think about the age and, if you like, physical condition of a lot of people that go out on cruise ships. If one of these people up here just loses their footing, handhold or whatever, this is going to be tears for a lot of people here. Fortunately, they do it quite successfully. Here's what a rope ladder is used for. One of the presentations I've put together is the history of pilot boats. So I went out in a pilot boat 3 times to just get some first-hand experience. Here we're taking the pilot off. It's out, the boat's out, the ship's out to sea. Here's the rope ladder, but there are 2 ropes here for handholds. So it's only the pilot's feet that go into this. It was never intended to be used the way it was on the Costa Concordia. Here's a shot of the helicopter lifting people off. So why did it capsize to starboard? The cross-flooding occurs and it comes upright, and then the breeze turns it over on starboard. Right, so what's led to this? The use of small-scale charts by the navigator. If he would have used large scale, he probably would have noticed the rock. They turned the computer navigation system off. Lack of communication. The key officers didn't know what were going on. They just stood there. He's showing off to his girlfriend. Communication with the helmsman, the hard to port, not well understood. The design of the ship itself with all of the switchboards and that down in the engine compartment. The fact that no one took command. Training of the crew who didn't know how to lower the lifeboats and a lot of things. And communication with the crew, the 40 nationalities. So very quickly, the cruise lines with something like this are quick to react. Now you can't leave the wharf without people going to their muster stations and understanding lifeboat drills and things like that. It's teamwork on the bridge. There's not a single person doing this. And surprise, surprise, you can't bring your girlfriend up anymore. And there's going to be life jackets placed around the ship rather than go back to your cabin to get them. Costa Concordia had no idea of the nationality of passengers on board, so they didn't know which language to talk to communicate with them. Now that will be recorded, and there's some standard emergency instructions, standard ways of doing things. Now lifeboat practice to make sure the crew do know how to do it, more teamwork on the bridge, and more life jackets placed around the ships. Well, here's the report findings. Surprise, surprise, scathing of the bridge management. The engineering crew did what they could when they were surprised, and no monitoring of the ship's instruments or position, and just generally chaotic approach, procedures not followed, and they didn't really understand how the ship worked. And normally in a situation like this, like they did on the Titanic, you put together a damage control team, the people that know the ship, engineering people, they go and look at the damage and assess it and come back and report it to the officers and the captain of the bridge. That didn't happen. And the final comment was failed in most aspects of duty. Not a great report card. So 5 people are found guilty a year later: manslaughter, negligence, and wrecking the ship. The crisis director who absolutely failed to ascertain what was going on, cabin service director in charge of the crew who didn't know what to do, the first officer, the helmsman, everyone on the bridge, third officer. However, they all plead guilty and managed to escape a 2-year jail sentence. So now with the recommendations, train people on the bridge, don't have anyone up there. Double hull, most of these ships have a double bottom in case you scrape something, but double hull up the side, more redundancy, double up on the backup generators, etc., and review the launching of the lifeboat. Surely with a ship with a fairly good list, you should be able to launch the lifeboats. Now here we get to the interesting bits, the salvage. First of all, of course, in a pristine marine environment, you need to remove the fuel. It's, as I mentioned before, it's assessed as a total loss. In 2013, they bring it up to vertical, and it costs $799 million to do this, just to bring it to vertical. It's not floating, it's still sunk. How would you like this on something you own? An insurance excess of $30 million. And 2 years later, they start the refloat. The cost is now 1.5 billion. Then there's a whole lot of cost for the towing and scrapping. The final cost is 2 billion. You probably can remember it was 900 million to build. Now, they're in a special protected marine area. There's all sorts of things there that are special, joint fan mussels. So they take a lot of this stuff to another area where it'll survive, and they've got heavy fuel oil, and you just can't suck that oil out or pump it out. It will change the attitude of the ship, which will do all sorts of interesting things. So you've got to take the oil out and replace it with water to hopefully keep it the boat stable. But unfortunately, during this time, there's lots of storms, so it's grinding itself under its own weight into those rocks, as you saw before, really damaging itself. Now, just think about inside a cruise liner, all of the debris, not to mention what's in the cabins, but you've got restaurants, you've got a casino, you've got all sorts of stuff. And if you think about how the ship is built, if you've got things like plasterboard there after being underwater, what's this going to look like? And they give up. It's too dangerous for the divers inside. They're encountering all sorts of things. So they resort to explosive, blowing holes in the hull to go in and look for bodies in the various areas. Here's one of the joint fan mussels that has to be removed. And if you're wondering what the inside of a ship that has been underwater for a while, this is what it looks like. You can see all the plasterboard or whatever the ceiling was. It's just all collapses into a huge mess on the floor. This is what looks like the casino, the poker machines. Somebody got to them before it sank. Now, how do you salvage a large ship today? There have been a few car carriers go out from harbour, and when they start to get into the sea, sink. And it's interesting to know how they sink. You've got a huge loading ramp out the front where the cars come in. And of course, that loading ramp needs to be closed and locked. So here's how this one sank. They've exited the harbour, they're getting into rough water, and the loading ramp isn't closed. So the supervisor says, oh, well, that's Fred's job. He's always been here in time. He'll arrive anytime soon. So he leaves, and there's two other of the crew there going, well, it's not our bloody job, union people. So the door doesn't get closed. Fred's asleep in his bunk. Water comes in, and of course, once the ship starts to roll, the water all goes to one side or backwards and forwards until there's enough water to turn the ship over. So here's a car carrier with thousands of luxury cars on it, like this on the bottom. Now, it's really simple to salvage a ship today. You know how heavy it is, the steel in it. You know if you've got a big crane, what you can lift. So you just decide, well, we'll cut it into 9 pieces, 10 pieces, whatever the number of pieces are. How do you do this? You take a steel wire, encrust it with diamonds. You put a platform either side, and you've got a giant hacksaw. You've got a cutting wire, you've got winches, and you just, wherever you've marked it out, you do a cut. So you cut the ship into the number of pieces required to salvage it. By the way, this is how the Russian nuclear submarine, the Kursk, was recovered. They cut off the torpedo department where all the problem was first, and then salvaged it from quite a significant depth. Now, you can't do this with the Costa Concordia. Imagine cutting through a cruise liner, through the cabins, etc. This is a car carrier. The cars are going to drop out when it's lifted, etc., or bits of cars. You can put down grappling hooks and you can clean up the mess. But how could you possibly clean up the mess from the Costa Concordia, the restaurants, the thousands of plates, bottles of wine, you name it, etc.? Not on. So here's an idea of what cut looks like. That's the engine room of that ship. It's all just steel, a propeller shaft, whatever. You just hacksaw it into pieces. What you do with the pieces is bring in a giant crane, pull up a couple 100 tons piece, put it on a barge and off to a scrapping yard. Another way to do it with a piece of equipment like this, cut it up and raise it like that. So you can't do it the way other ships are being done here. And there's just too much debris that's going to finish up on the bottom and it'll be impossible to clean up. And there are bodies still inside. So, well, what other time have large ships been salvaged? You may know the German Grand Fleet at the end of World War I was escorted into Scapa Flow, the massive harbour where all the British ships are, the British fleet. They're escorted in there and they're at anchor. And all the countries that won the war are sort of going, well, which ship do you want? Which ship we give? And it takes them months to break it up. But the Germans decide what they're going to do. They've been treated poorly. So on a given morning, there's a signal. They open the valves in the bottom of all the ships and 50 ships, including battleships, go to the bottom, which have to be recovered because they're a navigation hazard in the British harbour. So they have a look at that. But then what really interests them, well, the battleships in Pearl Harbor. I mean, a lot of these went to the bottom, capsized. I mean, the Japanese pilots that came in, they're all in battleship row, lined up in a row alongside each other. If a Japanese pilot coming in with a torpedo or a bomb, if he didn't get one, he was sure to, if he didn't get the one he was aiming at, he was sure to get one anyway. So it's a technique called power buckling, which is using ropes to rotate things. This is how things were loaded onto ships in years gone by. Also to put barrels down into cellars and bring them out, etc. So here's the Oklahoma, a battleship that was sunk in Pearl Harbor. You can see it, it's nearly upside down. This is how you do it. You weld all of these structures to the hull of the ship and you put in all of these cables, the mechanical advantage of doing this. You've got a winch here, but with all of these pulleys and cables, you've got a mechanical advantage of up to 100 they used. So what you're going to do is roll the ship over using these structures welded to the ship and all these cables and pulleys. Here it is coming up. The first pull is the hardest. You've got to get it to the suction. You've got to break the suction of the ship on the mud below. So that's why you need all these towers, is to break the suction. After that, it's a bit easier. Here it is halfway up. Here it is. The cables are attached to different parts of the ship here to bring it up. So it's sunk here. But now all you got to do is patch the holes up, pump the water out, put airbags in, all the usual things you do, and you can bring it to the surface. Here it is towed into a dry dock, but when they inspect it, it's taken something like 6 torpedoes. It's one of the few battleships that are scrapped. Most of them were repaired and put back into service. So this is how we're going to do the Costa Concordia. We're going to put enormous cables around the ship. We're going to put hydraulic jacks here. They're called strand jacks, which just hydraulically pull cables through. And we're going to weld sponsons on here. Now, all of the upper decks, there's nothing you can attach anything to. So it's all got to be done on the steel hull, which is quite difficult. We're going to put a platform here, what we're going to roll the ship onto. Now, just think of the size of this. This is 100,000 tons, 3-foot wall feels long. The divers have to go down, and you can imagine how long it takes them to jackhammer holes here, drive piles down. This deal here is like the harbour bridge. Now, imagine building this. It's 3-foot wall feels long. It's got to match the exact shape of the hull, because when the ship rolls onto it, if it's not like how it's set up in a dry dock, you're going to damage the hull, and then you're never going to float the ship. So the engineering here is just quite extraordinary to set all this up. Now, just in case the steel may damage, there's 2,000 grout bags here, which if you like is a pillow or a mattress for the ship to roll onto as well. So hopefully when the ship rolls, it's not going to damage the hull. So that's what a strand jet looks like. Hydraulically, it grabs a wire, pulls it through, locks it, then goes back and grabs it again and pulls a bit more through. Very powerful hydraulic jacks. So this is how it's done. The platform's put in place. Then all of these caissons, or they're actually sponsons, it depends which article you read, these are attached. These are 7 stories high, and there's something like 15 of them welded to the ship. All of the cables are put in place. The grout bed is put in place. And what we're going to do now is fill these caissons with water, pull with the hydraulic jacks, and we're going to roll the ship over until it's on the platform. Then we're going to weld another set of caissons, this time to the starboard side, and the ship is sitting, it's a sunk ship, it's sitting on the platform. Now we're going to pump air into all of those caissons and raise the ship and refloat it. Sounds simple, doesn't it? $2 million worth. So here's all the strand jacks over here, the cables, and I'll just show you a couple of photos so you've got some idea. Now this is massive size. Here's all the cables and all the caissons attached to the side of the ship. More shots of the caissons and the cables. Then the engineers discover when we roll the hull onto the side of the ship, it's full of water, of course. All of the water in the bow may break the bow off, and if the bow breaks off, they're in real trouble. So they've got to build a collar. Now, this is massive engineering. You can see the tugs down here. This is the collar that's going to go around the bow to support the bow and stop it from breaking off. Just huge engineering, thousands of tons of steel. Here's the collar here under the bow. So when the ship rolls, the bow will be supported. The main hull is going to rest on the platform. And here it is. It's done very, very slowly, as you can imagine. You don't, and you know, it could get away from you. So here it is. It's sitting on the platform. It's sunk, of course. And here it is. The air's been pumped out, and here it is floating. It's not floating as it normally does, but it is floating. So now we tow it. This is 2 years later. It's Genoa. Genoa's not far away in Italy, and it's going to take 4 days at very slow speed. And it's got all sorts of ships, fire tugs around it, just in case. They've got no idea what could happen. Nothing like this has ever been done before. And it's put up against a seawall in Genoa. Here it is under tow. That little tug out the front is not towing it. I think it's a steering tug. There are cables out both sides here. They would have a couple of ocean-going tugs moving this enormous mass. Well, what do you do with a 70-ton rock that you don't need anymore? You put a plaque to the 32 people that died and put it back where it belongs. Now, this ship is controversial to its end. So 3 years later, it's moved to a dock. And the removal of the upper decks, and then the sponsons are removed, and then the hull goes to a dry dock. And it's 5 years later before it's finished. Here it is alongside a wharf here, and things are being taken off. Now, how do you scrap a ship? You're not too fussy. You just either grab a piece of it with a hydraulic grab or just using acetylene jorts to cut it up, and you're not too fussy about how you do it. And here it is, the caissons or sponsons are being taken off now, that were welded to the ship. I mean, that would be a feat in itself, just to unweld, undo all this. And here it is in the dry dock. Now, I'll let you think for a moment. It's been underwater for some years. Just imagine what has settled to the bottom of this hull. Just think about maybe even the food, whatever. And the company that's got the scrapping is looking at this. It is a hazardous, very dangerous environment for anyone to work in. They do find the last body here, by the way. I think nobody is telling anything here. I think the company that was responsible for the scrapping said, look, this is the cost of, salvaging, getting the last steel out of here, and this will be the value of the steel that we'll get out. And then people turn up one morning and it's not there. It's been towed out to sea and sunk with all of that rotten stuff going to the bottom. All right, the epilogue. So people go, well, look, CHETTINO suffered shock. I mean, when you're in shock and nobody else took command, you can't blame CHETTINO for all this, send him to 16 years for jail. It should have had double sides. 16 years is excessive. I mean, the mafia who kill people don't get 16 years. And the investigation wasn't done properly. And he's one of the first people to be trialed by social media. The headlines of the Italian press is Captain Coward and things like that. So his trial was a bit not biased, but it was certainly done in the media as much as in a court. And there's a huge change in relationship between the company and the captain. This is the same for aeroplanes, most very sophisticated pieces of equipment. And unfortunately, most of these cruise ships are they're registered in places with the flags of convenience, Malta, Bahamas, where the safety requirements and the conditions for the crew are not as onerous as they would be in Australia or America. And of course, if something goes wrong, the officers are easy targets. And now with all of the technology, you probably know the MH370 plane, it took a while for Rolls-Royce to admit that their engines transmit via satellites the performance data of the engine so that they can do maintenance on it when it comes in for maintenance. And of course, but in an hour, a plane can go a long way. So a lot of these sophisticated things transmit what they're doing in operations. And of course, we're now at the stage with drones and that, where not only you know what's going on, you can actually take control. So some of these operation centers literally can take control, which means the captain isn't making all of the decisions anymore, isn't really in charge of the ship. Somebody in an operation center can decide this is what we need to do here. So things have changed very rapidly. So that's the story of the Costa Concordia, and more importantly, Captain CHETTINO.
That's fantastic. Wow.
Any questions from anybody?
Yeah, thank you, Noel. I don't know, am I on mute? Am I off mute? No, you're off mute. That was absolutely fantastic. I just have a couple of general sort of social science questions. The people that died, were they just a random range of people, like workers and guests, or was it all workers?
No, it was a mixture.
Okay.
Right. No, Glenn Addisall here, up in Queensland at the moment. You at the beginning of the presentation, you said he was in jail for a previous misdemeanor.
No, I don't think if I said that, that's incorrect. No.
There was a previous inquiry because he'd hit something.
Yes, he hit a wharf, but you know, that, as you saw from the safety record, that was nothing. You know, that was.
So he didn't get jailed for that.
No.
Good Lord. How long did he serve in jail?
I think he's still there, actually. 2012. Wait a minute, add up 16. No, he'd be out now. My understanding is he served the 16 years.
16.
Is he still married to the?
I can't find it. I've tried to find that out. I don't know.
But the girlfriend
having a lover in Italy, I mean, that's sort of nothing unusual, is it?
Hey, we're good.
Oh, please.
The ladies can have one too. I mean, I'm not trying to be sexist here.
Good Lord. Hey,
No,
Noel,
Why would we want one? One's bad enough.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I think it's a really interesting story. So you've already booked your cruises for 2022, have you? Just check out the nationality of the captain before you go.
no, that was fantastic. Thank you. Just a last question for you, maybe. You said that the last bit of the hull was towed out to sea.
Yep.
And sunk.
Yep.
Is there more story to that? I mean, that is fascinating and must sort of point to a bunch of corruption at a whole lot of levels.
Look, there are ships, Navy ships towed out. We tow our Navy ships out and sink them at sea. Fortunately, we clean them out before we do it. But there are ships being sunk. There are lots of this happening. Some people clean them out and other people just tow them out and sink them. So in international waters, there's nothing to stop you sinking whatever you like, unfortunately.
Okay.
It's very interesting to me because we were in Genoa for racing, and we actually saw it on the dry dock. And it was
Did you?
Yeah. So I took the picture that I put in the e-news. That was my picture. So we saw it. It was just amazing. We sailed around. Well, we didn't sail around it. We sailed past it. Yeah.
Wow.
I think what's interesting, and Noel touched on the airline industry being a good example. I mean, if you've got contrasts of things like the British Airways flight that went through volcano dust cloud, and the crews sort of stuck to the procedures and saved the plane, and the Qantas engine explosion. I've forgotten the number, but Crepinay was the captain, and you know, again, sort of very systematic control. Apollo 13, and then you contrast that with things like this disaster, and I don't know, there was a Taiwanese Airlines plane that went over the end of the runway at Kai Tak Airport, where that was again the question. The captain was, you know, nobody could question the captain, and all the rest of the flight deck, 2 other people on the flight deck, knew that he was flying too high but didn't dare say anything. You got these really interesting contrasts of the dynamics of the decision processes and the culture that are just critical in when things go wrong. Probably on a small scale, it applies on our racing yachts.
I've put together a number of presentations based on that book. There's some really interesting ones. You probably remember or know about the Battle of the River Plate, where the Graf Spee, the captain there, as you probably know, decided to scuttle the ship. The British baffled him a bit. But the reason he decided to scuttle the ship, he'd been in a battle with 3 British ships before he went into Montevideo to bury his dead. He'd lost something like 60 of his men. He was brought up in a Christian environment to value life, and he did not want to go back and fight and lose more of his men. He chose to scuttle a pocket battleship, a prize ship, one of Hitler's prize ships. He knew he couldn't go back to Germany, or he knew what would happen to him, so he committed suicide. I mean, that's his background played a key part in deciding to scuttle that ship. So if you're interested in any of this, look, the book's an absolutely great read if you're a maritime person and how people handle really difficult situations.
Yeah, he does.
I'm not on commission, by the way.
What is it? Who is it who organised the salvage? No?
It was an American company, if I remember correctly. There's a couple of really top salvage companies. The last one I've been reading about is when you put a ship into dry dock, of course, you've got to be very careful to have it balanced and all shored up and everything. And the Indians had one of their ships capsized in a dry dock.
Oh,
Oh dear.
And there was an American salvage company managed to salvage it out of a dry dock, which would be a very difficult, you know, if you can picture a ship in dry dock over on its side. I mean, you can't flood the dock. It's already damaged itself on its side. It's got holes because the wooden blocks that it's sitting on would have gone straight through the hull, etc.
Yes.
Yeah. Gee, that's fascinating, though. All of it.
All right, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
We did.
Yeah, thank you. Noel.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks for
thank you.
Noel, and thanks for coming along, and thank all of you for attending it along. And there's quite a few people from the wider club here as well, so welcome. We do interesting things quite often, and Zoom makes it a little bit easier at times than coming to the club, but we can't come to the club, so that's about it. So
Okay.
Well, thanks, Evan, and thanks Cruising Division for organising it. It was fantastic.
I do sailability, or I did. Do you do sailability from your yacht club at Middle Harbour? You've probably seen the sailability boats out there taking disabled people out sailing.
Yes, we do.
yeah,
Two Sundays a month.
Yeah.
Lynn's Lynn and Jill were very active in that.
Oh, Noel's been along a few times as well. So we've got some very frustrated sailors at the moment, itching to get down as well as us skippers.
yeah. Well, you can always go out to up. So Brian's been out there practicing. He's going to clean up this year, aren't you, Brian? Out there again Saturday.
Where is it?
Don't know.
Right. Well, anyway,
Okay.
thank you
All
very
right.
much. We'll say good night and thank you.
Thanks, guys. See you later.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good one. Catch ya.
Good night,
Bye,
everybody.
everyone.
Good night,
Thanks
everyone.
very much.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you.